This is the trainer of Dex Spellman, the guy who just got stopped by Anthony Yarde. When was it? Last weekend or the weekend before? I forget. But he has done this interview after posting something on Twitter, I believe, where he was complaining about the fact that his guy, Dex Spellman, has received a 45-day suspension from the British Board of Boxing Control after being stopped by Yarde, whereas Dillian Whyte only received a 28-day suspension from the British Boxing Board of Control after suffering a far more devastating knockout defeat against Povetkin. And he's basically complaining that there isn't any consistency when it comes to handing out these knockout suspensions. Now, for those of you who don't know, the rules are in the UK, and it's been this way for many years, any fighter who gets, stopped or knocked out receives a mandatory suspension. This is for safety reasons. Now, Spellman's trainer, Carl Greaves, again, argues that Dillian Whyte's knockout loss was far more devastating. So why does he receive a shorter suspension? And by the way, the two suspensions that they have, the standard suspensions, are 28 days and 45 days. Spellman got 45, Dillian Whyte got 28. There are various factors to take into account in terms of how much punishment each fighter took overall in the fight. Dillian Whyte didn't really take much punishment at all, just one solid shot, and that was it. Whereas Dex Spellman took far more punishment throughout the course of whatever it was, 7-8 rounds. But he didn't suffer the kind of devastating knockout. Now, I suspect that Carl Greaves is probably correct in making the assumption that there is some politics going on here. We know that Eddie Hearn is the most powerful man in British boxing and one of the most powerful men in world boxing. And perhaps he carries favor with the British Boxing Board of Control. Frank Warren certainly did for many years. He seemed to get the rub of the green when he was the top promoter in the UK a lot of the time with the British board. And now that Eddie Hearn's the top guy in British boxing, he seems to get the rub of the green a lot of the time. So I'm not at all dismissing the possibility that there is some favoritism, let's just call it that, going on. I'm not dismissing that possibility. However, Dillian Whyte fought Povetkin, when was it? The 22nd of August? Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that was the date. 45 days from the 22nd of August would take us through to early October. Now, in a normal training camp, you don't spar the whole way through the training camp. You might have, let's say, a 4-week or 5-week period of sparring. It varies from fighter to fighter and from camp to camp, but you might have a 4 or 5 week period where you're sparring. So really and truly, Dillian Whyte could have received a 45-day suspension and still had enough sparring to fight Alexander Povetkin. If he got a 45-day suspension, that would have taken him through to, as I say, early October. The fight is in late November. So he still would have had most of October and, a good deal of November to spar. Yeah, he might have been a week or two short of normal sparring, depending on how much sparring he does. So, and one thing that Carl Greaves pointed out in this Seconds Out interview, and Danny Flexen kind of pointed out, and Carl Greaves agreed, is that he's never had a representative from the British Boxing Board of Control turn up at his gym to check that any of his fighters who have been suspended following a stoppage defeat are actually not sparring. He's never had that. Therefore, you have to assume that because these suspensions are not really enforced, a lot of fighters are probably flouting these rules. So it's really down to the ethical, the ethics and the morals of the trainer and the people around the fighter in terms of, taking care of their health. The British board recommends that 45 days, no sparring, because the 45 days isn't just for fights, it's also for sparring, right? The British board recommends 45 days without any of it, or 28 days, depending on what they give the fighter. It's really up to the trainer to implement that the way it sounds. Maybe in more high profile training camps, you do get the British board coming in and, making sure that they're not sparring too early or whatever the case may be, coming into the gym. But with the likes of Carl Greaves and the fighters he deals with, apparently not. So now Frank Warren, as you would expect, has tried to make the most of this. And he said that, Dillian Whyte shouldn't be fighting this soon. It's not safe, so on and so forth. But he really needs to take up issue with the British Boxing Board of Control, who've only given him a 28-day suspension as opposed to 45. So that's really where Warren needs to direct his criticism. He's acting like he cares so much about Dillian Whyte's health. I personally don't buy that. I don't buy that. Frank Warren is an opportunist when it comes to criticizing his competition. And I just think he's just using this as an opportunity. He's using this as a stick to beat Eddie Hearn with, basically. To make out as though the Hearns are unethical and so on and so forth. I mean, Eddie Hearn said in a recent interview that he has never been in a legal, a court situation with a fighter. And he hopes that he never will. Frank Warren can't say the same. Frank Warren has really tried to go after fighters legally. And as we know, he's lost in several instances. Like against Joe Calzaghe, he lost. He tried to go after him legally. Tony Bellew, same way. He tried to go after him legally and he lost. But the majority of times he wins. Okay, and that doesn't mean that he's in the right necessarily. Because in legal situations, it's not always about who's right and wrong. It's about who can prove certain things. And it's also, in many cases, who's got the deepest pockets to pay for the lawyers in a protracted legal battle. And Frank Warren has got deep pockets. So a lot of fighters, they can't really afford a protracted legal battle with the man, even if they're in the right. So when he's running around virtue signaling, talking about, oh, it's terrible what the Hearns are doing and bringing up Lee Purdy and the sauna and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's kind of like the pot calling the kettle black, really and truly. If you're talking about being ethical and what have you. So anyway, long story short, I can see where Carl Greaves is coming from in terms of the lack of consistency for the British Boxing Board of Control. And despite the fact that Frank Warren is really practicing some selective outrage and probably hypocrisy, I can also see where he's coming from, if he was actually genuine, which I don't think he is, with regards to Dillian Whyte's health. Because fighters tend to be warriors. They don't consider their own health and safety as much as the people around them should and as much as the fans should. So, yeah, if I was in Dillian Whyte's camp, I would be concerned about him coming back against Povetkin this early. You don't know what kind of neurological effects a fighter can still be suffering from a knockout defeat like that and how long that takes to heal. So in an ideal situation, if Dillian Whyte was to rematch Povetkin, I think same like AJ, there should be about a 6-month gap if it has to be an immediate rematch. Preferably, in my view, he should take a fight in between. That might not be practical contractually. It might not be possible. But ideally, that's what, in my view, should happen. Take an easier fight in between to just get himself back in, winning ways, get himself back in the mindset of being in the ring, exchanging punches, maybe exercise some of those demons before stepping back in against Povetkin, and maybe work on some of the things that he's been working on to try and correct the mistakes he made in the first fight. So, yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below about this Dillian Whyte 28-day suspension. Carl Greaves being upset about the lack of consistency from the British Boxing Board of Control, hinting at favoritism. And I think he's, probably right. I can't prove it, but I wouldn't be surprised if that is the case. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. It's Ham and I'm out.